We are officially live. Hello, everybody. Joshua Hatton here with ImpEx Beverages, and this is what's airing tonight is the penultimate, the second to final ImpEx 3D series, Distillery Deep Dive series. And today we've got coming back is Chris Udy of ImpEx Beverages himself. He's the vice president of the company, and he is a guru when it comes to Japanese whiskeys. If you recall the event we had with Chris just a few weeks back, we were talking about whiskeys from Japan, specifically rice-based distillates coming from both the Oishi and the Fukano distilleries. And this time around, Chris is going to be talking with us about Japanese single malt, Japanese pure malt, Japanese blends, and really what all that means, because it does mean slightly different things. Well, at least pure malt does, and Chris can go into that a little bit. It means slightly different things than what we're used to. So I'm going to bring Chris on. Where is he? There he is. Hello, sir.
Hey, I'm on the Facebook page trying to like comments. It's weird because there's a lag. You're still scratching your arm.
All right.
I don't know how that.
Come back in 10 minutes. I'll be scratching my arm again.
What's going on, guys?
Yeah, so I'm excited. Well, first off, I'm always happy to be spending time with you, but you and I want to say a few months back, sometime during COVID, whatever that time means, where you gave everyone at ImpEx Beverages a really nice 101 course on Japanese whiskeys, and specifically pure malts and single malts and blends. And so I'm excited to talk about this stuff with you. But I need to have something in my glass.
Go for it.
Yeah, what are you gonna pour? What are you gonna put in your glass?
Since we're talking about Japanese whiskey, I'm gonna pour the Kilhoman Winter 2010 edition.
Whoa! Oh, okay. When you said 2010, I was thinking vintage, but you're talking about the old 2010 old bottle, like early stuff.
I've been staring at this fucking bottle in my closet for 10 years. I'm drinking it. That's it. I built the new whiskey cabinets and I got no room for everything, and that's the problem. And I realize I'm gulluming all of these different whiskeys, and so I need to start I loved this bottle. I love this particular Kilhoman release is one of my favorites way back when, and so I need to just enjoy it and let it go, because plastic cup, because we haven't moved the glasses into the house yet. That's right. You guys are about to get educated by the creme de la creme, the top class whiskey drinker you've ever met.
I just love that you referred to hoarding bottles as golluming them.
Yeah,
because they're your precious. Yeah. So, well, because I try to stay true to themes. I don't know if it's a fault or an asset. Let's call it a fault tonight. But I'm pouring a little bit of the Matsui Mizunara cask.
Yeah, we were sold out of that. They shorted us our last 2 orders.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. So let's
start by saying I love the Kudayoshi and Matsui whiskeys. It really is because I'm trying to kill bottles in my closet that have like this amount or less. And so it's like a new, that's what I've got to do from now on. Last night I was drinking bourbon. I know hell froze over. It was very cold in Burbank. Now it's all malt, I guess.
So a lot of people, when they think of Japanese whiskey, first off, I would say the majority of people would say, oh man, I heard the Japanese are making great scotch, right? Mm-hmm. That's an issue in and of itself, but I think it's a good point, right? Because when people think of single malt, the shorthand for that is Scotch. Right or wrong, that's just the shorthand, and I think that's a really good job. That's job well done by the SWA, right? Shows you how strong the word Scotch is when it comes to single malt. But Japanese whiskey, it's a new category, and a lot of people got familiar with it through the lens of Yamazaki and perhaps Hibiki blends and maybe some Nika products, Yoichi and so on. And then of course there's the pure malt category, which throws a bit of a wrinkle, and most people don't understand that. And then a few weeks ago, you and I talked about rice whiskeys. So the category in and of itself, and I didn't even I mentioned blends through Hibiki, but there's a lot of other blends. So the category of Japanese whiskeys or whiskeys from Japan, and I know you've delineated, what is a Japanese whiskey and what is a whiskey from Japan. It's a confusing category. So I'm hoping, was focusing on blends, focusing on pure malts, and focusing on single malts, if you could take us through what the hell all that means when it comes to Japanese whiskey.
Yeah, so it all started back in 1492 with a friar. No, what happened was you kind of have to look at it historically and in trade, right? So Japan was a closed country until 1853, and that's when Commodore Perry came into one of the bays, and he brought his ships with him, and he basically brought an armada and said, hey, we want to start trading with you guys. You need to open up. And with him, he brought gifts, and one of the gifts was a few barrels of whiskey. And Japan kicked him out and said, go away, come back in a year, maybe we'll talk then. He showed back up in 6 months with a larger fleet of ships and said, no, we're about to start doing business.
What year is this again?
1853. So,
okay. Yeah.
And so this is from memory. I might be wrong. We can look at a timeline in a little bit, but let me get through this and my thoughts, and then it'll kind of flesh it all out. Okay. And what's important about that is because Japan is a closed society, you don't have an exchange of ideas, like you don't have an exchange of vocabulary. And we talked about this with the Whiskeys from Japan session, where we talked about how distillation over there took on its own vocabulary because of the fact of this lack of change of ideas. Whereas in America, we use the word whiskey because we were settled by Irish and Scottish immigrants, and they brought that word with them and their distillation practices with them. And like, what would you call Pennsylvania rye if you didn't have that language switch? Because it sure as heck doesn't taste like malt whiskey, right? They taste like two very different things.
Yeah, exactly.
So he brought the whiskey with him, and it was well received. And then within 20 years, you have guys who are starting to do basically a whiskey style clone. They don't have access to they don't really have access to the Scotch malt whiskey process yet, but they kind of know. And so they're taking a distillate and they're infusing botanicals and they're putting coloring in it, and they're trying to make like a whiskey-like product that they start to sell as whiskey. And that's the genesis of what Japanese whiskey is going to be. And that's about like 1872.
So they're not producing at this point. They're bringing in the whiskey from elsewhere. They're adding in their botanicals.
Right. There's hundreds of distilleries in Japan at the time, but they're not producing a product that they're going to call whiskey, because the whiskey to them is a foreign thing. It's not their domestic. They could be producing something that kind of looks and tastes like it, but the word whiskey to them is like a foreign concept. So they're trying to clone that, and that's where it all begins. And then you have like the godfather of Japanese whiskey, Taketsuru-san, founder of Nika, who also helped Tori-san open up Kotobuki, a distillery, which then became Yamazaki. He goes over to Scotland and he studies in Speyside and in Campbelltown and brings back the knowledge of the technology with him. And he comes from a sake family and decides to build copper pot stills and do basically a single malt whiskey clone. And that's where Yamazaki comes into the picture, right? Well, he has a 10-year contract with them, and the 10 years runs out, and they're not in agreement with what they're kind of producing. He wants to try to find a more Scottish style climate, and he's really anoraked it out. Like he wants to basically mimic single malt Scotch whiskey. So he founds the Nika project, and starts to sell apple cider, I think it was apple cider, to generate funds for him to build Yoichi up in Hokkaido, which is going to more mimic the Scottish climate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where those companies part ways. And that's kind of where Japanese whiskey distillation, like with the purpose of calling it whiskey, begins. But ironically enough, the first whiskey license issued in 1919 goes to another company, and they don't build their first set of stills until 1960s. Now, the reason why that's kind of important is that the genesis of Japanese whiskey is based on blending, and that's it. You had Nika-san, you had Taketsuru-san, who came in and wanted to do a Scotch whiskey clone, but even his top sellers were blended whiskeys. Tori-san's top sellers were blended whiskeys. There's a great book by Stefan Van Ecken called Whiskey Rising. I'll put it in the chat here. Sorry, guys. Whiskey Rising. Stefan.
Yeah, you've suggested that book to me a few times. I've still yet to grab it. I know I need to.
And he's definitely got an agenda in the way that he writes. He's got it's editorialized with what his opinions of what things should be are, but it's a great basis of historical facts, a great basis of knowledge, and he kind of proves that everything is based on blending. And I think I spelled his name wrong. It's close enough though. It might be with an F. So this is important because if you take a look at it that way, it kind of fundamentally changes the way that you view the category, right? Like we view bourbon as being an American spirit, but it is, but it kind of isn't. They used to make bourbon in Canada. They used to make bourbon in Mexico. There's the only reason why you only make bourbon in the United States now is because of trade agreements, and so it's a weird way of looking at things. But the genesis of Japanese whiskey, anyways, dates back to the 1870s, based on blending. Then you get into Tori-san, who even as he made his money to found Suntory was, by the way, selling Old Hermes Scotch whiskey that wasn't Scotch whiskey. It was a blend of what he thought the Scotch whiskey would taste like. And then he used that to open up his distilleries, and that's kind of where it begins. And that's to this day what it is. Like, a lot of people don't realize that whiskey in Japan is defined by a tax law. It's a license you have for your distillery or you do not. And it's a set of taxes, and it's run by politics. Like, if you're on the island of Honshu, you can have a shochu still and a whiskey still in the same building. But if you're on the island of Kyushu, it's not allowed. You're not allowed to do it. So it's kind of this weird up in the air thing. Now, I hope that all 10 of us that are on this thing don't try to let that deter us from really appreciating what Japanese whiskey is, because it has found this newfound fame in both the blends and the single malts. And it's not because of the provenance of the distillate, but in what's actually in the bottle. And so when you look at Japanese whiskey, when I look at Japanese whiskey, I review it on the liquid that is inside the bottle and the quality of that liquid. It's going backwards again. If you guys ever do one of these StreamYards, if you go to the right, it's not a mirror, so it throws you off. So inside the liquid of the bottle.
Oh gosh, you've just screwed me up for the night. That doesn't make sense.
Anyway, so it's important to kind of comprehend all this as you go through it, because a lot of people look at Japanese whiskey and they're like, it's a Japanese distillate, and it can be. A lot of times it is, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's distilled in other countries and brought to Japan and blended there. What Japanese whiskey is, for me, I think, and what I can argue from a historical standpoint, is that it's an expression within a bottle. It's a flavor profile, and that's what's changed.
So let me put a pin in that right there, because you talk about what whiskey is to you from a historical standpoint, what Japanese whiskey is to you from a historical standpoint, and why you believe that is correct. However, there are a lot of people outside of the industry that would say, yeah, but if it wasn't made in Japan, then why are we even calling it Japanese whiskey? So you touched on it a little bit. Can you pull that thread a bit more to go just dig into that historical significance a bit more?
Yeah. So again, unapologetically, I would say that's someone projecting their thought of what things should be onto a different culture, right? Like you talk about cuisines you eat in different countries, and people look at you like you're insane. Well, that's what they're doing, right? Like it's got to be done this way. Is your view of saying somebody else's culture has to do it your way, and I think that's just not incorrect. Let's just look at it for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what it is blending. Can you pull up the slide that has the tax records?
That's with the third grade, second grade, first grade.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there we go, making things happen. Okay.
This is actually from Stefan's book, and I guess I cropped it. Sorry. I should have the what do you call it there at the bottom where it quotes them. But this came directly out of his book where he did the research. And if you look at like 1943 and you look at third grade whiskey, which was the top selling grade of whiskey, it was the most popular whiskey. You had 0 to less than 5% of actual whiskey in the bottle.
Wow.
And everything else was blends. Like
but they would call it whiskey.
They could call it whiskey. You could make it with non-whiskey items. You can make it with whatever you wanted, but you would try to achieve what you would consider to be a whiskey flavor profile, and you could call it whiskey. Again, it's just in the name. And that continues all the way up until 1968, which is that yellow line. Thanks, Graham, for spelling that right, by the way. I don't know if there's a lag there. but it really is a great book. It is a great book, and I think everyone should read it. He's got a little bit of a Western take on it and projecting like what he thinks whiskey should be in Japan, but like I give it a 10 out of 10 overall. And in 68 it finally changes to where the third grade whiskey is 7 to less than 13%, and then in 78 it changes to 10 to less than 17%. And the reason why is there's kind of a malt tax. So the more malt that you have in something, you pay a higher tax on it, and that continues to today. If you ever go to Japan, you'll buy a drink and you go to like any 7-Eleven will sell beer, and the beers will say all malt on them, and they'll be more expensive by $1 per can than other ones that are just kind of made up with like Chuhais or kind of near beers, where they're like a different type of malted grain, and it's just a different thing. But this kind of sums it up, I think, because you can argue all the way back. Like when you look at the first license being issued in 1919, they didn't build their stills to the 60s. You look at these old tax records where you could have 0 to less than 5%, 0 to less than 10%. It shows you that they weren't concerned with the provenance or the actual distillate itself. They were only concerned with what physically goes in the bottle. And it gets, you can push it even further into the 80s where you have where Margaret Thatcher came in to renegotiate Scotch whiskey tariffs in Japan. And I think I mentioned this at the last one we did, but in the 80s, there was a $6 billion trade deficit between the UK and Japan, where the UK was buying $6 billion more worth of goods than they were exporting to Japan. And Margaret Thatcher went over there with a coalition and said, look, guys, we need to balance this out a little bit. And if we can't do that, we're going to basically put tariffs on Japanese imports into the UK to try to recoup some of that loss. And the Japanese government yielded to it, and they lowered the tariffs on imported Scotch whiskeys, and it was so significant that immediately you had investment from Japanese companies into Scotch whiskey distilleries. Like within 12 months, I think Ben Nevis was purchased by Nikka, and all of that juice was going to a lot of it was going to make Scotch whiskey, but a lot of that was coming into Japan to be part of their blends as well. And they've recently come out and admitted to that. Susanna Skyver Barton was able to put a bunch of pieces together to link that in records to where people couldn't hide it anymore. It's fun.
So that's, this is a good point where you say people weren't allowed to hide things. And there's nothing saying that a producer has to disclose what's in the, even to this date, if you have a Japanese pure malt or a Japanese blend, there's not a law dictating that they have to disclose what's in there, what country it came from, etc. Am I right?
Yeah, no, you don't You don't. I mean, like with any whiskey, you can kind of get away with it, to be honest. Like you could take American whiskeys and blend them with Canadian whiskeys. As long as it's dominant American whiskey, you could probably get away with calling it American whiskey. It's again, it's a unique conundrum to have, where you have a bunch of people who are now really getting into whiskey and really wanting to figure out what it all is and try to make sense of it, when sometimes you got to say, man, just relax and just try it in the bottle. Like you start to pick it apart too much, you're losing the soul of what it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
So no, you don't have to disclose any of that. And different companies have come out with different ways of saying what they will and won't do, and that's not part of this discussion. But but it's like, if you just take a look at the history and you take a look at the category becoming famous before all of this hoopla began, then you just got to realize that it's pretty cool for what it is. So embrace it for what it is.
Yeah.
Like we were all huge fans of High West when they were first getting started, because they were pushing the envelope of like really good rye whiskey, right? And there's really good rye whiskeys came from Canada. A lot of folks knew it. A lot of folks didn't. It didn't matter. They were putting out really good juice in a bottle. And that's what mattered. And I'd like to think that same courtesy would be extended to people and to companies in Japan. Now, the companies in Japan that are putting out shit whiskey, fuck them. That's on them. You don't have to buy those bottles. But if they're putting out good stuff, just give it a break. The big guys do it. You should let the little guys do it too.
So let's talk. I want to get into some of the history, because you do have a bit of a timeline. I have a slide that shows a timeline, and so I want to touch a bit more on history. But I thought it'd be good. I finished my Matsui Mizunara.
Grab another whiskey.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab another whiskey. You still working on your Kilchoman?
Yeah, that's why that bottle's been sitting there for 10 years, man. I drink slow as molasses in Canada in February.
All right, so this, let me see. This is what I'm about to pour. Let me share this.
Ooh.
Matsui Sakura cask, which I'm curious to hear more about. I mean, I know about this, but on behalf of our viewers, I'm curious to know more about this Sakura cask. So before we go into some of that history, we touched on it in the last one, but can you explain to people again this idea of a Sakura cask, which I don't think exists outside of Japanese whiskey maturation?
Yeah, so well, it's about to. It's there. That cask kind of got popular, and a lot of people are jumping on board now. So with Matsui, they do a couple things different. The Mizunara and the Sakura, they're actually just the barrel heads are replaced. So they're matured in bourbon barrels, and then they swap out the barrel heads. So it's a Mizunara barrel head and a Sakura barrel head on both ends, and that's where they get that influence from. But Sakura, cherry blossom trees in Japanese, you call Sakura, is it grows all over Japan, and it is kind of like the Japanese tree. Like you see it anywhere in the world, you associate it with Japan.
Yeah, sure.
And because they have such a large amount of these trees, they have enough wood to make barrels out of them, and they started experimenting with it, and they turn out to be delicious. Now, the trick with Sakura cask is it's hard to identify with sister flavor profiles. So sherry cask is easy: dark dried figs, dates, unsmoked pipe tobacco, blah blah blah. Bourbon cask, vanillins, honey. With everything, you can kind of do it. Port cask, raspberries and super fruity notes. But with Sakura, it's kind of its own unique flavor profile. And even when you talk to people from Japan and you ask them about it, who are grown up and raised in it, what they'll just refer to it to other Sakura foods. So they'll say, "What do you think a Sakura cask tastes like?" And they'll say, "Oh, it tastes like Sakura mochi." Now in Japan, that makes sense because everyone knows what Sakura mochi is. But here in the U.S., the Ralphs or Kroger or whatever part of the country you're in, they ain't got no Sakura mochi on the shelf. So it's a hard descriptor for people to get their heads wrapped around.
For me, it's there's almost like an omishu kind of plummy plum wine kind of thing going on.
Give me a flavor profile that's not Japanese.
It tastes like plum wine from California. I don't.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Like, that's what's kind of beautiful about it is that it's we every time you talk to me about whiskey, I always say how my favorite thing about whiskey is that it's never ending, and there's always an expansion of the pie. And my biggest pet peeve about whiskey drinkers is when they try to limit that and say, no, that's moussin, like it's got to be this way. It's like, no, it doesn't. Let it go and flow. But that's what's kind of cool about that is that it's establishing a provenance of Japanese flavor profiles that's new and unique, and the Americans will hopefully incorporate it into some of their craft whiskeys, and we'll all have a good time. And more bottles in our closet that we can't fit.
I think in a way that's kind of good, right? You've got the SWA spends a lot of time and money and people power to ensure that Scotch whiskey is protected. And I think in part, they're also trying to protect the general flavor profiles of the spirit. And this flavor profile with this Sakura cask, you don't find in Scotch whiskey. It is kind of, at least for now, exclusive to Japanese whiskey. So, I mean, I guess I feel okay about my Omishu note because
it's great. Like it's funny because it's the line that I draw is like the Colombian government spends a lot of money trying to stop cocaine production, but you know what? People love to do their lines, so it's just relax.
Are we going to be doing lines after this?
No, I'm too old for that. I'm clean cut. My whiskey's all I got nowadays. Yeah, but it's like just relax. Let it see where it goes. People will. If you try to put a really bad whiskey in a bottle, you're going to get called out on it. Like there's going to be people might not directly say it to you, but your sales will suffer and your brand will suffer, and that's just going to be all there is to it.
Yeah.
I'm idealistic in that fashion.
Oh, so delicious. Before we move on to or move back to some of this history, Kevin Obis had a very good question here. Someone told me once Japan started using Sakura in World War II and they couldn't get ex-bourbon or brandy casks. Any truth to that?
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? I don't know what they were doing in Japan in World War II.
Come on, Chris. That's perfect.
So my answer to that would be almost definitely, simply because if you look at when a question like that pops up, the way that I think about it is, what were the materials needed for wartime efforts? They would have needed steel, they would have needed glass, they would have needed rice. So you would have been left with a strain on any type of material to transport things. You'd have been left to strain on. So you got trees in the backyard, you're going to go back to making oak barrels. Why not?
Yeah.
Sakura's a lot easier to work with than Mizunara for sure. And then you can't really you can use cedar maybe, but you really can't use pine because pine's got turpentine in it, right? So it's going to give all flavors. You can't use it to store food. So they might have used Sakura barrels to transport all types of things. And liquid definitely could have been one of them. Now, Mr. Obis, in World War II, there was a moratorium on distillation for a few years. So only the people way back deep in the countryside that weren't having their fields rations had extra grain to distill with. So there was that. But towards the end of World War II, none of the distilleries were supposed to be producing, unless they were producing industrial ethanol for use for wartime efforts. Like that's how significant World War II was on the strain of Japan's resources, because it's an island, right? Like basically you had rations and whatnot.
Yeah.
So about the Sakura thing, I don't know. It completely makes sense. It's just started to grow back into fashion. Just like with anything, right? Mezcal barrels in Scotland. It's a brave new world for whiskey, and so everyone's celebrating.
Yep. That's definitely fair. So I'm looking at a timeline here, and some of it you discussed. There's a lot of ins and outs and what have yous. And so while I'm sipping on this Sakura, and while you're sipping on your Kilhome, I love that you're drinking Scotch whiskey during a Japanese whiskey thing. I hope we can go through this timeline a little bit, because I think it really paints a good picture.
So to be clear, I love all whiskey, right? And,
it's
just why not?
There you go.
I drink a lot of Japanese whiskey, probably more than most folks. Jesus, that timeline's tiny on my screen here. Hold on, let me see if I can zoom in. Oh yeah.
Hopefully the people watching have can see it a little better. Aren't watching it on their phones. If they are, I apologize.
Yeah, so this timeline's just kind of fun because you have that a lot of this is from Stefan's book as well, but you have that you have basically Japan being closed in 1853, and then when they open up, you can see where like 1853 to 1868, that 15-year period, Western liquor Yoshu starts to become known. Kuriyoshi Takiguchi tries to replicate Western liquor by blending shochu with madder and steeped in sugar and syrup to because shochu at this time isn't being put into barrels, it's kept in clay jars or it's just drank new. So they're starting to practice the blending. This little red line is a fun thing because before Japan is distilling any whiskey, you have a guy named Takamine-san doing the koji process in the United States, and the Americans are referring to that as the Japanese whiskey process, and Japan hasn't even started messing with any of it yet. So it's fun because it ties together the 500-year history of distillation in Japan with the bourbon production of Peoria, Illinois, and pre-prohibition. And it kind of shows that, like, again, instead of that little red box is something I put in there because instead of showing how things are separate from each other, like why Japanese whiskey is this or why bourbon is added, why Scotch is this, why all distillate is related in one way or another, and how it is just all shades. It's like the colors of Benetton. It's great. Then 1899, Shinjiro Tori, the founder of Suntory, opens his liquor store. This is relevant because Suntory is now clearly the dominant power that they are, and they are. We can argue that they are the reason that Japanese whiskey is popular now, and every producer owes that to them. And so it's important to kind of document their growth within whiskey because it's relevant, right? They bought Jim Beam. They're awesome.
Yeah.
1901, you got a law on taxation of liquor beverages containing alcohol. So that's actually a very significant year because before then, it was all willy-nilly. Like if you really think about it, you go back into the 1800s, Japan's countryside. So you don't have water bills or gas bills or anything like that. Your fuel is what you have in the backyard, and you can pull as much water from the river as you want. And there's some distilleries that still kind of benefit to that. The Shinjiro Tori sells the Hermes Old Scotch whiskey. This is 1911. It's not from Scotland. That's directly from Stefan's book. And, I think it's awesome because, again, it shows the genesis. The founder of Suntory starts out generating money to build what will become Yamazaki by blending domestic things and calling it a whiskey from a country that it's not, right? Like it's the idea of creating something with the materials you have, not necessarily the provenance of where the materials were made.
Yep, that's a good way to put it. Yep.
1918, Masataka Taketsuru goes to Scotland to study whiskey production. We all know the story of that. 1919, Egashima gets the first whiskey license, but they don't build their stills till the 60s. Wow. And then you just kind of go, you kind of go through it, right? 1923, 1924 is when Yamazaki opens. Kotobukiya is what it's called at the time. They have the 10-year contract. 34 is a significant portion because that's when Taketsuru leaves Tori and leaves Suntory and goes to found Nikka, which are now the two big ones. Then 1940, the liquor tax law was enacted. We saw that chart earlier. The G whiskey boom of the early 1980s, this is an important one because there were a lot of whiskey licenses given out, and there was a lot of different blending in the early 1980s of foreign spirit being released as whiskey in Japan and little craft distilleries releasing whiskeys in Japan. And a lot of them failed. A lot of them made awesome whiskeys. Like in my collection, I've got, 2000, there you go. Hanyu closes, Kadoizawa is mothballed. I have Hanyu and Kadoizawa in my collections. I have, Sunshine whiskey, which is what, I can't remember the name of the distillery now, Wakatsuru Distillery. And then I've got Golden Horse, which is Tozu Shuzo. And like all these different little craft distilleries that made these really great whiskeys. Some of my favorite whiskeys came from those distilleries, and they're just lost to history because the significance of the Thatcher Jose in '89, like that fundamentally changed the landscape of whiskey in Japan because you had craft distilleries popping up, the import tax on Scotch whiskey drops, and it immediately starts to drive them out of business. It's so significant that within 11 years, Hanyu closes. Katawizawa is mothballed. All these G whiskey producers just stop producing. There's no point anymore because Scotch whiskey is so cheap in Japan. There's a gravitation towards that. They didn't have time to develop. It's kind of like the pressure that there's a direct parallel between that and the pressure that a lot of craft distilleries now face versus the new bourbon boom, where they're so far behind on the production scale that they're trying to keep their cash flow going, make their stocks. They dealt with a barrel crisis a few years ago that they were trying to overcome. Do this experimentation, pushing the envelope with a pie, and everyone's like, why would I buy this when I just go buy a cheap bottle of bourbon? And they're missing the whole point. The point is like, these are the seeds that are going to grow into the botanical gardens of what whiskey will be. And this gets stomped out with that Thatcher Zose in '89. That's what they call it, Thatcher Zose, which is the Thatcher tax.
Okay.
And then 2013, Jim Murray, he's done a lot of crap things, but he did write down that he did give Yamazaki the boost in his 2013 whiskey Bible that kind of launched Japanese whiskey into the Western market. I remember that exact same year before the book came out, going and buying the whiskey that he put, the Yamazaki single sherry cask. I was buying it for $70 US, as many bottles as I wanted in Japan. And I was drinking them like crazy too. They were great. It was awesome. Open one up, drink it, open another one up, drink it. And then overnight they were like $1,300 a piece or something crazy. And it was just, and that's when the wheels fell off, right? Like that same year, for anyone who's listening, that same year, I remember going into, I was really into Japanese whiskey. I love Yamazaki, and I was going into the liquor stores in Orange County, and Southern Wine and Spirits had been running a 1-on-6 for the Yamazaki 18, and it was $89.99 on the shelf.
It's a good price.
Yeah,
Proper
so
price.
I was buying them up. Space Invaders bottles, like I was buying them up, drinking them. They were awesome, and now that bottle's a $500 bottle. There was one last thing on that thing, and that was in 2014. They did it's okay, you don't got to pull it back up. But in the 2014, the Masa teledocumentary came out, which was a television series about the life of Masa Taketsuru, and he it immediately depleted all the aged stocks of Nika in the market. So it was again great because the press release came out in Japanese a day before it came out in English. And my wife caught it and she said, hey, they're discontinuing Miyagiko 12, Yoichi 15, Yoichi 20. And so then I spent rent money going around buying all those bottles so I'd have for years to come. But it was because what it did was it was a perfect storm. 2013, Jim Murray woke up the Western market to how awesome Japanese whiskey was, but like the blends and the single malts. And then a year later, the Japanese community was woken up to how awesome it was because they saw the strain on Yamazaki. And that television drama came out, and they immediately switched from whatever they're drinking into drinking whiskey because they're a homogenous people. And when they make the shift, it's not a small shift. So it just decimated all the stocks, and then we see the pricing at where they're at now. So it's a little bit bananas. But,
go ahead. I had a question, but I finish your thought.
No, that's kind of the end of the thought. It was really kind of an amazing thing to see, like overnight, an unknown category. Like I remember sitting in a bar in Ginza drinking the King of Diamonds Ichiro, which is now like a $5,000 bottle. Actually, it's probably more than that. It's closer to $8,000 bottle. It was $15 a shot, and I was enjoying it. And the guy next to me, the Japanese guy next to me, he's like, "What are you doing drinking that Japanese stuff when they have all these good Scotch whiskeys?" And I was like, "Well, I think it's pretty good." But
it's interesting. So 2 points. My first point is, like you, I'd been buying the Yamazaki sherry cask, the annual release at 55, 65 pounds a bottle, and I would get one or two each time. And I remember somehow, probably through my blog, getting an advanced sample of I think it was the 2013, the one that Jim Murray said was the best. It was the first time I passed on the sherry cask because I thought it was so lackluster compared to the previous ones. And then it made this thing, but my tastes are different than Jim's. I'm not saying he made a bad decision. It's just so interesting how
Yeah,
different
Crown
palates.
Apple.
Well, yeah, well,
Yeah,
that's
Crown
another story.
Apple.
So in 2013, Jim Murray says this Yamazaki sherry cask is the best whiskey in the world. Japanese whiskey goes from being very easily accessed at decent prices to completely inaccessible, not completely inaccessible, but much harder to get, much higher prices. And I'm talking specifically Japanese single malts and then some of the hibikis as well, like really focusing on Suntory and in the Nika brands. So my question to you, and I don't know if you know this or not, if you know the answer to this or not, but in 2005-ish, when Scotch whiskey started taking off, well, the distilleries found themselves in a bit of a pickle. They weren't producing to the levels that they should have been based on this, all of a sudden, this massive demand. So in 2005, things started to ramp up. 2005, 2006, they're making more and more and more whiskey. And now me as an independent bottler, when I look at what's available to buy, there's a shit ton of 2005, 2006, etc., up to 2010, all available fairly easily. And so my question to you is, did Japanese distilleries follow suit when Japanese whiskeys went gangbusters? Did they increase production? Are we going to see more availability at some point?
Yeah, so Johnny Mundell is the guy to ask for this, man. He did a presentation when he was with Suntory. This was, I want to say 4 years ago, and at that presentation, he said that they predicted there was going to be a shortage for the next decade. So maybe another 6 years of shortage. The year that came out, if I remember correctly, and I might not, the year that came out, the Suntory Yamazaki had done 3.7 or 3.1 million liters of alcohol that year. You've got Suntory, you've got the Hakushu, you've got 10 single malt distilleries or whatever that's operating. And when you put that in perspective, Glenfiddich alone does 12 million liters, right?
I think they've got a capacity of 14. Maybe they do 12. Yeah.
But at the same time, they would have done 12 million liters, and that would have been one of 110 Scotch whiskey distilleries operating at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not all of them are operating at that level, but it's exponentially a larger amount of juice being produced versus what they were doing in Japan. So yeah, it absolutely sideswiped them, and recovery time would have been way longer simply because they had produced so little and there's such a heavy pressure on them to kind of get the juice out there. So I'm sure that they immediately ramped up as fast as they could. You had and this is it's in my mind now, so I kind of have to say it. But again, remember that's just one case example, but that is by no means the definition of the category, because if you look at the different distilleries within themselves, like Yamazaki's built a certain way, Cheetah's built a certain way, the Nika's got their still set up a different way. You go to Kirin, they've got a thumper on there or a doubler.
Really?
So oh yeah, it's made bourbon style. Okay. It's like a dunk in one of those stills. So it's I think everyone got sideswiped. I don't know who's recovered and who hasn't, but it's kind of all crazy go nuts bananas. Like there was a Fuji-san Roku, which was an 18-year-old that was readily available, and there was the Kirin single malt, which has always been available, and to this day you can still get it in Japan, and to this day it's under $20 and it's perfectly fine, and that's still available. But the Fuji-san Roku, like a year later, came out in duty free, and all of a sudden it was a blend versus a single malt. So clearly nobody was ready for it, as they shouldn't have been, right? Because it didn't make sense before then.
Yeah, exactly. We got a question here from Chris Wingate. Let me bring that up. So since Scotch was so cheap after the Thatcher Sauce, which I want to say Kaiser Sauce so badly every time I see that. Anyway, was there an initial flood of popularity for Scottish brands, and did it stick where Japanese brands had to grow awareness, or were Japanese blends quickly popular in Japan?
So the blends had always been popular since the dawn of the tax era. The blends were the cheaper ones. They were taxed the least, so they were the most consumed items, if that makes sense. So really, the Thatcher's Ose, what it allowed for, yes, single malt definitely increased in its awareness and in its profile in Japan. There was a lot of marketing that went behind it as well, and but Japanese blends, I think, were still very much in the mindset of people who are drinking whiskey. But the other thing the twist there is that the proportion of, and again, this is speculation, so I like this is editorialized. I can't prove it, but
sure.
The percentage of domestic created spirit versus imported spirit into those blends would have shifted because of that shift of the import tax. Does it make sense? If you're not paying import tax, you just bring it in and bottle that stuff instead of making it domestically. It just makes more sense.
Yeah, sure.
So to answer that question, it'd be yes and yes.
Yeah.
It's a great question though, because you look at it like Ben Nevis is a pretty popular brand in Japan. I would see that in like weird little pharmacies, and you couldn't even find a bottle in the United States. And Lafroig has always just been huge in Japan. If you guys want to know, like on the other side of things, the big fundamental shift I've seen in the last few years, and I don't know what's going on now because I've already missed 3 trips over there because of COVID. And sorry, my kids making those rounds. But since the Beam Suntory acquisition, the shift has been from used to see Four Roses everywhere and IW Harper in a lot of places. Now it's all Jim Beam and Makers everywhere.
Wow, isn't that funny?
And Four Roses, I'm seeing it less and less and less. So, but Four Roses is owned by Kirin, so there's a little bit of a battle there going.
Okay, that's interesting though. But you 2 brands come to mind: Ben Nevis and Lafroig, like you had mentioned. So Ben Nevis, purchased by Nika in the 80s, just after the Kaiser Sose, Thatcher's Ose thing. And then, of course, Suntory buys Beam.
You know that deal was brokered by an attorney named Kobayashi, right?
Are you kidding me?
Of course I'm kidding you. It's just
okay. Oh, Jesus. So both those brands, Ben Nevis and I could be wrong with Lafroig, but there's a reason why Japanese brands would want Scottish brands, and that's in part to feed some of the pure malt brands that are selling in Japan and selling in some parts of the world. And so I'm about to pour, and actually let me bring up a picture so people can see it a little better. So I'm going to pour the one in the middle. Well, actually, no. I'm pouring the one that's not on there.
Ha! That's a limited edition. That's going away. What we have is what we have, and that's it.
So I'm pouring the 8-year-old sherry cask.
Yeah.
And so
the box on it's different and everything. And I would have had the same slide. I just want to say this. I would have had the same slide for the single malts, except for I haven't removed all the Jim Murray awards yet, because that's got to be done. We got you, Melissa. We don't need none of that nonsense.
We got everybody on that one.
Yeah. I haven't done it yet, so that's why I didn't put the slide in.
So talk to us about pure malts, what that means, and how they're fed, how they're kept alive. What is Japanese pure malt?
Oh, so pure malt just means all malt. It just means it's made with 100% malted barley. That's it.
And by the way, that's what's being Kuriyoshi is a brand of pure malts.
Yeah. So if you hold that bottle back up in Japan, man, I hope no one from the TTB is watching. In Japan, that bottle says Kuriyoshi pure malt whiskey. When we submitted those labels to the USTTB, they said you got to take the word pure off. And then 3 weeks later, approved another brand that said pure malt whiskey on it. And I was like, what the? I get so tired of arguing with them. So basically, if you see the word, it's just like with Scotch whiskey. If you see the word malt on the bottle and it's not accompanied by the word single, then it means that it's 100% malted barley, yeast and water, and that it is not from a single distillery. Because if it is from a single distillery, you're gonna have that's what they are. If it means it's not from a single distillery, because if it is from a single distillery, usually people have the gumption to write those extra 6 letters on the bottle that say single, so that you know it's from a single distillery. So if it says pure malt, or if it says all malt, or if it just says malt whiskey, it's generally a vatting of different single malts into one bottle. Now, those single malts could be produced in Japan. Those single malts could be produced in other countries. That's just the way that it is. The hope, and this is also my hope for anyone that enjoys it, is that and again, if you bring up that other slide, it would be very beneficial at this point. The one, the picture of all the Kuroyoshi pure malts, is that you will enjoy it for what's in the bottle and understand that a lot of effort goes into that, and you can see it with the awards that they win, right? So here it's like these are consistent year-over-year awards in multiple competitions between World Whiskey Awards, International Spirits Competition, the International Whiskey Competition, and the San Francisco Spirits Competition. Like across the board, they track well with like in the 90s with their points, and even the awards that I've taken off of there from other folks. So it's important to remember that, right? Because what are we really striving for at the end of the day? Are we looking to, like, in some cases, yeah, we're looking to lick the rock that comes from the farm that is the place where, you know, the fairy peed back in the 1700s, and that's just what it is. Or are we looking for like just something beautiful that's in the bottle? And I would kind of argue the latter with a lot of things, and that's like Japanese whiskey was raised on that, and I feel it's almost imperative to kind of keep it a little bit of that tradition alive, simply because it's part of what they are, and it's part of what's made them great. Like, if you know, it's like a chef, right? You know, they say what grows together goes together, sure, but like there's chefs who just take stuff from all over the world and put it together, and when you drink it or when you eat it, you're like, oh yeah, and that's the same idea there. Or a bartender that takes ingredients from 7 different countries to make a badass cocktail. Yeah, Summer Jane Bell about that. She's the master of that stuff.
Yeah, in talking about the Kuroyoshi, I've often compared it to Compass Box, in that what they're looking to do is create really good malt blends with a consistent flavor profile. Now with Compass Box, you've got a mixture of Kleinleach and a few other distilleries going on in there, and you get that signature Compass Box profile, which is fantastic. And John Glaser, is predominantly working with Scotch whiskey producers, though he's played around with some other spirits as well. But with Kuroyoshi, and by extension other pure malt producers, not only do they have the luxury of being able to use malt whiskey from various distilleries, they have the luxury of using malt whiskey from distilleries from various countries to play a part in their whiskey. And like, if we think back to the Matsui Sakura, right? To me, that whiskey tastes as if it comes from Japan.
That's a single malt. So,
but no, and this is my point though. That's a single malt. But my point is, if you're a blender creating a malt whiskey from malt whiskey producers from different countries, you can potentially have different flavors that you simply would never expect, because Amrut and Paul John have this kind of Indian feel. I taste Paul John, it doesn't taste like Scotch whiskey to me. It has different flavors going on, right? I taste the Matsui Sakura cask single malt, and it has another flavor profile going on. And both of those seem very true to their terroir, right? And so the point that I'm trying to make is, I look at pure malt as almost Compass Box plus, because you can source malts from different countries to create a kick-ass whiskey. Am I thinking about that the correct way? Am I explaining it the correct way, or would you say that's off?
I think you are, and I think you've touched on something that there are you've touched on something where I'm going to show a raw nerve of mine, where I have people who who start to hate on things because it's not the way that they think it should be. But what's important to remember, what you said was from different countries. Like everyone's like, oh, this is just Scotch whiskey in a bottle. And it's like, man, no one ever said it came from Scotland. You don't know where the pure malt comes from. You don't know where the malt, it can be from anywhere. So, but those who judge immediately like to come up with a verdict out of it and say it must be from here, but it could be from anywhere. Yeah. Like, why not, man? It's, it's whiskey. Just have fun with it. If it's good, drink it. If it ain't good, don't drink it. And do like me and have 1,000 bottles in a set of cabinets that you're never going to touch.
So what feeds these pure malts? Is it you've got Nika that owns Ben Nevis, and therefore they can put a load of Ben Nevis in with their Yoichi and Miyagikyo and create different pure malts? Is it
no, well, it's more than that at this point. So historically, yeah, there was a tax break. So why not bring it in from another source where they could produce on a more efficient scale, and you could get in the malt that you wanted. Like, it's a lot easier to send the condensed ethanol than it is to send a bunch of grain and a bunch of peat and a bunch of, like, well, the water would be domestic, but to ship all these different components in and try to do it locally when you could just buy the finished product that was more economically done in its proper country. Does that make sense? Like, historically, that's the way it is. Now, what it is now is, I think, a pressure of the simple fact that there's a lack of distillate. Because when the boom hit, no one was ready for it. So if people don't have single malts for you, what makes you think they're going to put their single malts into a pure malt when they don't have single malts for you that demand a 30 to 40 to 50% higher price tag on it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Like, if I don't have single malt X, why am I using single malt X and blend Y when I could just be selling single malt X all day long and sitting back on the lawn chair counting my cash? It doesn't make sense. So there's a pressure of like, that's just an external pressure of demand on the supply, which would probably drive that now. But the fundamental thing to remember is that it's historically accurate. So it's kind of weird, right? Because people are saying, well, this is what they're doing now, and it's like, no, this is what they've always done. You're just now wising up to it. Now you're mad because you didn't do your research first. So just, again, like, where it will be in 5 years, who knows? Because a lot of producers are producing a lot of stuff, but I like to think that there's always going to be a room for like some type of innovation on that front, if it makes sense, because it kind of depends. Like, unless you're building just a massive continuous still, you're going to be hard pressed to keep up with production of your single malt. We'll look at it with every supplier we do since I'm drinking Scotch whiskey, the suppliers we deal with out of Scotland, like, a lot of them are doubling up their production now. Like Kilchoman doubled their production, Edward Hour doubled their production. Everybody's expanding. Macallan built an entire new complex simply because no one could see the boom happen. So anyways.
So they're playing catch up. Yeah.
Everyone's going to be playing catch up. And then when you and I are old and our livers are shot, there's going to be a whiskey lake again. And whoever the young nerds are getting into whiskey are going to be like, what do you mean? Why is this expensive? It's so cheap and it's everywhere. This is great. We're going to be sitting there going, you have no idea what we struggled through.
I know. It was uphill both ways. We'll tell everyone.
That's right.
Uphill
both ways in the barley.
So Travis had a question here. Have you seen a rise of interest in Japanese whiskey since the tariffs went into effect? I mean, obviously the craze of Japanese whiskey has been going like this.
Turning the screws in my ribs with that 25% tariff. Just remind me about it after workout, buddy. No. So I don't know, to be honest, because if I'm truly honest with you, Travis, COVID has kind of trumped everything. It's trumped tariffs. It's trumped everything, to the point where we're so busy just trying to be on the hustle and make sure that our brands are represented and getting out there in the market and getting in people's hands. We don't have time to look around and say, well, is it because of this or because of that? We're just trying to make sure that everything is on the up and up, and that, like, we're doing right by the people that have entrusted us to do right by them in the center of the globe that has handled the pandemic the worst out of anybody else. Like, it's kind of, that's what we're doing. So maybe there's a shift to Japanese malt whiskey because of that lack of tariff, and so it's become a little bit more price competitive. But I still see I'm still seeing really cheap bottles pop up in Trader Joe's, right? And I'm seeing really cheap bottles pop up in Costco. So I don't know if that necessarily has to do with it, because if it was a pure price thing, I could see people switching to alternative brands of Scotch whiskey that have somehow managed to maintain their pricing while the tariffs were in place, maybe because they're such a larger production or they're vertically integrated somehow.
Yeah.
That's the best answer I have to that. So it's I don't think I have the authority to answer that the correct way. I definitely have seen, and Travis, this might be relevant to your question, we've seen a shift between, there is a trade down in price point and a trade up in price point. While we've seen this K economy, as folks like to call it, happen, there's been a segment of the market that is just trying to buy the cheapest, largest format liquor they can get. And there's been another section of the economy that's doing so well that they're like, oh yeah, make it rain, and they're getting $100 and $200 bottles. So
Wow.
I don't know if that helps expanding on this question or not, but yeah, Travis, thanks for reminding me about the tariffs. I'm drinking Kilhoman for you and everything, buddy. What's going on? And so you guys know, I can't see any of the other comments. The way this format's set up, when anyone talks to Joshua, we're on a separate screen. So if there are comments like saying hi, we have no idea. We just want you to know that, like me and any other speaker that's on here, we love you, and we're going to read these comments later. And then I'm going to text you.
You should be able to see them.
I can't, because there's a lag on the Facebook
Chris,
side.
Oh, but no. Oh, I see. But if you go into StreamYard, if you're looking in the StreamYard back end, you can see all the comments from Facebook and YouTube.
Yeah, you didn't give me access to the back end.
Joking there somewhere.
There's no comments here.
All right.
So,
well, let me see. There was a very good question here, and we got screwed up. Where is it?
That's because I'm probably the worst guest ever to have on here.
Yeah.
And by the way, we are having a meeting next week about what the position of the future of the director of firm handshakes is, seeing as how we're now in a virtual age and my job has become irrelevant. Sam has still told me I have to be in the office to discuss my future with the company to see if I'm sticking around or not. How do you respond to the guys saying Japan whiskey must be produced in Japan, i.e. changing the laws? Like, it's their right to do that, Brian. Like, there's obviously a lot of confusion in the category, and there's a coalition that's been formed, and they want to change the laws. And if they do it, that's what it is. That's the history of the world, right? Everything, all business, everything is based on the rules that the government sets. Rockefeller did a lot of weird stuff until they made laws where he couldn't do weird stuff anymore. And nowadays, there's a lot of weird stuff until the laws change. Like, everybody will operate within the laws that the government set, and that's just going to be what it is. Like SWA, Joshua touched on it earlier, is a perfect example. They were no mezcal cask, and now they're like, okay, go for mezcal cask. And now you're going to see mezcal cask. Everyone will adapt and adjust and just move forward, and that's all we can ever do. If they make laws really strict, it'll be, if they play to prejudices, or if people allow themselves to fall into their own prejudices of what they think it should be, they're going to miss out on some really good juice. I will say that, because if the laws become too strict, and if they say you can do this and you can't do that, that leads to stagnation. It doesn't lead to innovation, and it doesn't lead to adaptation for the current palate, or adaptation to beautiful things that might happen, and people will lose out. But if that's the way it is, and that's the way it is, it's neither here nor there. It's just reality, right?
Was there talk? I feel as if there was at one point in the not too distant past, where there was discussion of potential adjustments to laws in and around whiskey production and nomenclature around what can go on a whiskey label in Japan. Is that a thing? That
is a very real thing, and they were hoping to get it done by the Olympics, and then it didn't happen. And who knows? I mean, again, I'm not going to speculate on that, right? TTB sent out a thing, going back to TTB, they sent out a thing saying, should we allow 700 mLs in the US? Everybody replied yes. 700 mLs in the US? I don't see them yet. When they show up, like that's the thing. There's a Netflix, the guy who was like the main economist for Bill Clinton. I can't remember his name, but he like the best quote I ever heard, which I can't remember how to say it either, because that's the way I operate. But basically the gist of it was, the government sets the rules, and that's what defines how economies work. And so whatever rules are set, we play by it.
Mm.
Tomorrow, Scotch whiskey might turn around and say you can be 1 month old and call it a single malt. And that'll, believe me, that'll change the game. You'll start having cocktailed single malts at less than $10 wholesale from very large producers. Like, you're going to see a whole new slew of White Dog coming out of Scotland if they did that. But the chances are they'll never do it.
Yeah, imagine if here in the U.S. we reversed the laws around what can and what cannot be bourbon and relax the stipulation that you had to use a new charred oak cask. And that would affect Scotch whiskey production. That would affect rum. That would affect so many things, because we here could just reuse that cask without issue. So laws, as much of a pain in the butt as they are, you can find opportunities with them, or to work within that sort of box.
Think about what would happen if they did if they all of a sudden regulated sherry cask production in Spain for use in Scotch whiskeys. Like, it used to be that all the sherry casks had sherry in them for 30 and 40 years. Now they're 1, 2, 5 years. That's changed the way sherry profile is in Scotland. For better, for worse, it's up to the individual. But if they went back to try to replicate that, then you might see more whiskeys that showed in the 1960 style. And it is what it is.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question that came up, and I feel as if
talking about my tariffs, I don't want to hear it.
it's Travis again asking about tariffs. No, from Julie Lynn Czar. What is the main difference between Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey, other than the fact that Scotch is made in Scotland, and if it's Japanese single malt, it's made in Japan? But what would you say are the main differences or difference?
That is a great question. First off, like, it's probably a more educated man than me should be answering it. But I have two answers to that question. One is philosophical and one is factual. And of course, the philosophical one will be more important, so we'll save that till after the factual, at which point, when I do the factual, you have to remind me what the question is so I can answer the philosophical one. But the factual one is Scotch whiskey is regulated by very direct law saying that it has to be distilled in Scotland. And if it's single malt whiskey, it has to be bottled in Scotland, and Scotch whiskey must be a minimum of 3 years old. Right? And those are the two main laws that differ from Japanese whiskeys. It must be distilled in Scotland, must be a minimum of 3 years old. Japanese whiskey can just be blended or modified in Japan, and there is no age regulation. That's where it stops. There's no age regulation. So those are the two main differences. They have a lot more similarities. If we start talking about the similarities between the two, then this chat will go on way beyond the time. And I know it's late and everyone's bored already, so I'm not going to take you through all that. But the philosophical answer to that question is that Japanese whiskey, in my mind, is built from the center out. It's built to be very balanced, and you can see it. Scotch whiskey is built to be balanced as well, but it's a little bit different. They'll get a little bit heavier footed, or they'll get a little bit heavier handed in certain profiles of certain regions to kind of develop what they want. Like, Scotch whiskey is now currently heavily evolving as well. You're starting to read about distilleries really paying attention to their yeast strands where they didn't used to do that, really paying attention to the barley strands where they used to just go for the newest barley that gave them the highest yield and that was the most pest resilient. There's a change in Scotch whiskey happening there. The Scotch whiskey, like Islay, it'll do big on the smoke for a lot of the part. Scotch whiskey will do try to be reflective of the brand, the equity of the brand or the distillery. This is single malts I'm talking about that they're representing. And then on the blended side, it was a production to try to meet the blend profile that had long been established, and the production of the whiskeys that were going in that blend to satisfy the needs of that blend for years to come. And that's what Scotch whiskey is. Japanese whiskey is, in my mind, it's built from the center out. It's meant to be a complete spherical item. It's a reflection of their cuisine. So in America, we use a lot of salt. We use a lot of sugar. We drink Coca-Cola. We use these heavy, thick flavors in our cuisine, and that kind of is reflected in bourbon. And in Scotland, it's a little bit more bland, but it still kind of is the same. Whereas in Japan, like if you buy a confectionery in Japan, there's very little sugar in it. Like it takes you a few weeks to acclimate to the diet over there, to acclimate your palate to where you finally pick up a donut and you're like, oh yeah, that is incredibly sweet, because you have to get everything out of your system. And I think the whiskey is a reflection of that. Like when they talk about whiskey notes in Japan, when you direct translate them, they use words like bitter, which is something you'd almost never see in a Scotch whiskey flavor note. They'll say this is a little bitter, this is a little sour, it's a little sweet, it's got a little bit of umami, it's got a little bit of like, and they'll encompass all of those different flavor, all of those different tasting profiles to describe what they're working on. And I think that's inherent in the philosophy of Japanese whiskey. You can see it in most of the blends. You can see it. The single malts have become a little bit more heavy-handed in what they're representing, but historically, it's always been about trying to make something that's smooth, non-offensive, very easy to drink, something that's really good in a highball or really good as a base for a cocktail. And that's where they excelled at, is like, you know, thriving in the simplicity of the whiskey, right? Not making it taste like burning, which is like, we're starting to see a push on the other end with what consumers are getting, because they all want it to be. And single cask nation is a great example of this. You guys bottle a lot of stuff at like 55, 58, 60. What was the highest one you had? It was in the 70s?
69.85% alcohol.
So 69.85. Like that is just bananas. That's something that's kind of unheard of in Japanese whiskeys. And they do a lot of 40s. They even do 38% whiskey over there. It's a different thing for the general market. Now, obviously, when you start talking about single malts, wherever you're talking about them, like a single expression or single cask, that flips that on its head. But the distilleries that were doing like these super club-footed, heavy sherry casks with high ABVs, that was Kadoe's Island Hanyu, and they closed down for lack of space. So it's those would be that's a very long ass-winded answer to a very good question, but those are the main differences, I think.
Well, there's a really, hold on, my cat just farted. Oh, come on, Icky, you go down there. And my whiskey's gonna smell really crappy, so I'm gonna wait. So a good follow-up question from Julie.
So Japanese whiskey learned from Scotch whiskey, so comparison. So in the single, like that's what it was, and that's what it started out to be, but it didn't end up being that way, because that was the whole split between Taketsuru and Tori-san. Like that's why he left Suntory, was because he felt like they were diverging too far away from the Scotch whiskey knowledge that he had brought over with him. And that's why he went up to go to his Yoichi. Now, within a few years, Yoichi ended up like, they weren't doing well in the market, so they had to resort to blending to be able to make their ends meet. So that's when it's not about who they mimicked, it's about what their consumer base demanded, right? So it started out, yes, by cloning Scotch whiskey, but the consumers in Japan, they wanted something a little bit different. And that's where it shifted to. If that makes sense.
Okay. So let's talk quickly. Sorry,
and the government, right? Sorry. And the government
sets
laws on malt taxes, and the government sets the rule, and everyone plays by them. So there was pressures there from a monetary standpoint as well to use alternatives to malt to keep the costs down, because whiskey was really expensive. It was like it was a chunk of your day's salary to get a bottle.
Got it. So we've discussed pure malt, but what we've not, at least not specifically discussed, Japanese single malt, and specifically the Matsui single malt. And so Matsui owns Kuriyoshi. That's their pure malt brand. But then Matsui is their single malt distillery, and people know I've now had two.
So now we're gonna do this where we try to get our hands to go the right way. Put your hand up and try to do the upper level, right? So the Matsui company owns the Kuriyoshi. I can't do this at all. The Kuriyoshi Distillery, which produces Matsui single malts, Kuriyoshi pure malts, and Totori blended whiskeys. Now, Matsui is the name of the guy who owns the company. Kuriyoshi, the name of the distillery, is also the name of the city where the distillery is located. And Totori, the name of the blends, is the name of the prefecture, or in American, the state that the city is located in. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, cheers, Graham. Thanks for
cheers, Graham. Thanks
for tuning in from Canada. Close up the store. Now's y'all's chance to rob Graham. Go for it. And so that's kind of the way that they're set up. And so the blends are named after the state, the pure malts are named after the city, and the single malts are named after Matsui-san. And the single malts are exactly what they are, 100% malted barley. The pure malts are also 100% malted barley. And then the blends would be a combination of different grains and malted barley. And as far as what this particular grains are, they keep all of that very close to the vest. So just like you can't go to Johnny Walker and ask them, they'll say, oh yeah, these are in it, but they're not going to tell you what proportions. They're not going to tell you how they go about doing it. They're not going to tell you the vintage. It's the same thing with them. They protect that because that's just the way that they operate.
Yep. Makes
There's
sense.
only like one real blender who does all that, and that's Compass Box, right? And they did it almost reactionary as a way to just piss off the SWA because they were giving them so much problems.
So I had a question for you with regards to Matsui. So you had sent me two different images, and I'm going to bring them both up if you don't mind.
Oh yeah.
Right. So there's that with these alembic stills, and then there are these more traditional looking copper pot stills, which have a really cool, and I definitely want you to talk about this. I don't know if people could see it on their screen, but where the line arm connects to
the other one first. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so let's go to these alembic stills. Can we talk about what they're doing with those?
So these are 3 by 1,000 liter Portuguese pot stills, and this is what they started making their single malts in. And again, when like pure malts, it's just like with any other craft whiskey distillery. You've got to generate money to be able to increase your production, be able to buy the goods. You're not born overnight as a multinational conglomerate that just has money falling out of the sky. You've got to start from somewhere, and this is what they started with. And you can see Fukui-san, he's the master distiller, and that's his size versus those 3 stills. And they use these stills now to make their gins. They use these stills to make their brandies, and then they'll still do a little bit of whiskey experimentation in them as well. But after they generated enough money from operating these stills, they moved over to the next slide, please. This, which you can see Fukui-san again. I did not hit him with the shrink ray. This is his size versus the new stills. And these are Japanese-made 5,000 liter wash still and 3,000 liter spirit still. Now, you can see also up here these silver plates. And the way that these were engineered, oh yeah, I'm using my mouse like you can see it, but I don't even get to see the comments.
There's one there.
Yeah, and those plates are adjustable, so they can actually loosen the fittings on the top of the line arm, and they can loosen the fittings on that silver bracket, and they can adjust it to give them different angles. Let's see if I can do this on an upward angle or a downward angle to mimic different types of heaviness of malt. And so they built that in there so they can adjust it and do more experimentation with it. Wow. They've also started to, and this is what you're investing in. Like when you buy Japanese blended whiskey from anybody, when you buy Japanese pure malt whiskey from anybody, you're helping to invest in the future of the diversification of the category. And they've used those funds to contract with a local farmer to do a local barley whiskey, where they're growing barley in the Tottori prefecture and taking that and making malt out of it. And they just built a kiln as well, to where they can take peat harvested from Hokkaido and they can take peat harvested from Akita and peat a locally grown barley to do kind of like a single estate type deal. But those are going to be a few years out. Those will be a few years out in the making. But you can see where, like, I get this, and this is again me editorializing, but I've gotten a few emails where like people are just out to make a quick buck. Well, you're not making a quick buck when you turn around and you invest $1 million back into the distillery. Yeah. Right? Like it just doesn't work that way. If you're making a quick buck, you take that money and you go home. And you're going to see, people are going to see a few companies or a few brands that just kind of come and disappear. And that's going to be people trying to come in and make a lot of money and cash out. And it's their right to do it. But you can see with these guys, they're actually reinvesting back into the facility so that they can expand their production. They can bring you more single malts of a diversified profile and just help to really elevate the entire category as a whole. Because whenever you have somebody putting pressure onto the other companies that are involved, everybody starts to innovate, right? And that's just what it is.
That's a real
background.
Look at that! There he is. My demon is much smaller and furrier and gassier. Well, I don't know. I haven't.
No, mine's pretty gas.
Oh, here's we're getting close again. We have about 10 minutes left, and so questions are coming in. And before we leave, I do want to touch on the Tottori blends. But before we get to the Tottori blends, For another one from Travis. How does Japanese peat compare to Scottish peat?
You know, it's funny, Travis. I would just say it's a little less briny. It doesn't quite have the salt seaweed aspect to it. If that makes sense. It's a little bit more earth tar. It's more of like it's more. Hold on. He's getting a real ruckus here. Kaito, you want to say hi to everybody? You want to be? So it's got more of like just a smoke to it. It doesn't have that briny characteristic that you get from the Isla peat. It's more like a Speyside peat, right? Like a heavily peated Brook-Laddie or like
okay.
It'll have more of that profile.
That makes good sense. And that's interesting though, because I mean Japan is just one massively long island. You would think you'd get a bit more sea spray going on. But then again, my geography
but I don't get it. Then again, somebody else might agree with me, right? That's a personal perspective on it.
Yep, good point. And Julie had.
Now I should also say,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't know how much of that stuff I've had, right? Because the only Yoichi, which is up in Hokkaido, which was built there, which has access to those peat fields, that's, different expressions of heavily peated Yoichi is what I'm basing my statement off of. There might have been other expressions that have that peat in it that had a salinity to it, but I just didn't associate the two, right? It's like the data points are fewer. So again, I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to answer, but that's where it's coming from is my experience with different vintages of heavily peated Yoichi.
Got it. And Julie had a follow-up question.
Barley.
Barley. Yeah, they do.
But that question actually makes a lot of sense because the word mugi in Japanese translates to both buckwheat and to barley.
Really?
Yeah, so if you type mugi into a Google Translate, it'll translate it into buckwheat and to barley, and so you have to know which mugi you're talking about, which is why that's actually a brilliant question. Even though she's like wheat has a different word, but buckwheat and barley is that one, but it would be barley.
Okay. It's the same word?
Yeah, you type in mugi in Google Translate. I asked my wife about that, and she was being a little bit vague with me that night. But my understanding is like it's the same word for both.
Okay. So before we get out of here, I think there are a couple other questions.
They're crazy over there, right?
Was it? They're having a lot of fun.
They're crazy over there with their whiskeys. Like they're like it's the same. Anyways, go ahead.
So talk to us about Totori. So you mentioned the Matsui umbrella. Where you've got Matsui single malt, Kuriyoshi pure malt, and then Totori blends. Talk to us about the two different blends. And while you're talking, I'll just bring up pictures in case people are not familiar with the Totori blends.
Yeah, so Totori is just basically badass blended whiskey. It is these are ex-bourbon barrels, so it's a combination. Go back to the other one, the Totori ex-bourbon. So think of this. I think it's done with a bourbon style mash. Dominant ingredients corn, but again, that's me speculating. But that's what I taste when I taste it. So think of it as bourbon without all of the oak. So it's a combination of new oak and a combination of ex-bourbon barrel. So it's like a bourbon without all the oak punch, and it's just really soft and it's kind of deceptively dangerous. You'll drink more of that than you intend to when you sit down.
Yep.
And then the next one,
for a great highball too.
It does. It really does. And you can do
really like it.
Like the Totori ex-bourbon is good for like a shiso julep. So instead like sub out the mint and put in shiso leaf, and then do the Totori ex-bourbon and kind of like take that style on doing a mint julep, and it's a fun twist on it, and it's really quite nice and refreshing and a little bit of a mix up.
What's shiso leaf?
Shiso is it's like a Japanese mint. It's you've had it. You just probably don't realize you've had it. It's really it's awesome.
Okay.
You take that and you can put in a little bit of you muddle up a little bit of plum as well, and it's like they're good. Like onigiri with shiso and plum is dynamite. But the Totori blended, the red box, that's a Scotch style blend. So it's 50% malt and then barley and corn, and they'll and it's just like that's my highball drinker right there. Like that with a slice of lemon. I'll when I'm in Hawaii, with our Hawaii distributor, he and I, there's an izakaya we go to that's the guy's from, he's not from Okinawa. I can't remember where he's from, but it's Izakaya Naru, and he and I'll just put down a half a bottle of that while we're eating everything that he makes for us, and it's a great evening. But there, that's 94 points Ultimate Spirits Challenge. It's like a $40 bottle, and the other one's like a $55 bottle, and it's 93 points, and they're both good and they're great. Like that showcases what Matsui-san's trying to achieve with his name on the bottle, and with their blending techniques. Like that's kind of the soul or essence of Japanese whiskey, if you will. Like balanced, ready to be crafted into something new with the cocktail, or just ready to be enjoyed, but very spherical.
Yeah.
Very spherical in that it's got a little bit of everything on it. It's a little bit bitter, it's a little bit sweet, it's a little bit malty. It's finer on the palate, but it does carry weight at the same time. Like that's what they're trying to achieve there, and it's fun.
Yeah, I had one of those nights that you talked about where you're going through a bottle, but that was Penderyn highballs with David Cover.
Yeah.
At the Liberty in New York. And
Penderyn was great because you get that apricot finish to them. Yeah, don't with a Penderyn highball, don't add any fruit to it. Just drink it and adjust your whiskey to your liking. But I tend to drink them weaker because, again, being from the South, I'm a volume drinker. I like to drink a lot, but no fruit. You get the apricot on the finish, man. Like it's nice.
So I'm going to ask you a question that I've been asked multiple times, and I'll be very honest in that I've done one of two things. I've either been very honest and said, yeah, I don't know the answer to that, or I've said, well, going by taste, I think that this is happening, right? So when we were going between the two different toteries, the ex-bourbon barrel in the black box, and then the one that doesn't say ex-bourbon barrel in the red box, really the differentiators there seem to be grain-driven rather than cask-driven. And so my question to you is, do you see a change in the packaging where there's a focus on flavor profile rather than the cask type it was in, because both are from ex-bourbon barrels?
No, so basically with the Totally, it's ex-white oak, so they don't specify if it's a bourbon cask or what was in it ahead of time. So there could have been malt whiskey there. It could be like that malt profile. It is 50% malt whiskey, so that could be a refill malt cask. Whereas the ex-bourbon barrel it's clearly got a heavier portion of new oak in it, and you can see that in the coloring between the two.
Yeah, sure.
So no, I don't think so. Like again, there's really no point to it because you're like, their stance is pretty clear, and for better for worse, it is what it is, where they say, we believe in our blending abilities and we want you to believe in our blending abilities. And so quit asking us so many questions about it and let us get on with our job and enjoy what's in the bottle, right? Like that pandering to any anorak that wants to know exactly what's happening. It's cool, but it's just not always part of people's business model, right? Like a lot of companies just do not do it. Like you do not see, Glenfarclas does not put its percentage of bourbon cask to sherry cask on its whiskeys.
Yeah.
It's not on there. They've got both. And if you ask someone, maybe they tell you, maybe they don't, but it's just not part of that business profile. That is a very niche thing that isn't reflective of most of the market. And it's weird because people bring that bourbon mindset to them where they're like, oh, well, they know it's new oak because bourbon by law has to be matured in new oak. And so that's what it is. But when you get to the bourbon finishes, they don't ask, like with the sherry cask bourbon finish, well, how long did it have sherry in it before you put the bourbon in there? How long was the bourbon in
right.
it?
Yeah.
You can divide that up and start to really nitpick it to where there's no joy left in the whiskey. And the Matsui company just says, just try it, and if you like it, great, and if you don't, we respectfully understand. But they do pretty well. So
Yeah. There's one more question I want to get to, and then I want to end on something that I think sums up everything that you've just mentioned. If I could just find it, and I may not be able to find it. So I can't find it.
while you're
So
doing
this
that, I'm
is
gonna
what.
take a look at the chats here.
So this
Kevin,
is what I'll tell you.
$1 a leaf though. Kevin, you own a house. Grow it in your garden in the summertime when it's not really cold. The different kanji
So
probably. Brian Vitale. I don't know if the kanji between buckwheat and I think it's the same kanji too, which is why it's a little confusing. Again, I asked my wife about it. She was being a little cagey because it's like you have to really kind of go and dig when you start to look at things. Because there was a whiskey that came across my plate, and I was worried because where it was, there was some possibility it could be buckwheat, and I had to really kind of dig to confirm that it was going to be barley before I started to go for it. What was your question, man? I'll get out of the Kevin's.
So I couldn't find the question, but Julie's been great here. Julie's been asking some really interesting questions. So I'm going to leave this as the last question, and so here we go. So with the barrels used, you're not getting the flavor lime everyone else flavor. I don't know if she meant to type lime. Scotch comes from the initial blend, the barrel, etc. And now not only does Scotch have theirs, but so does Irish.
Well, so let's see here. Let's try to dissect this for. So with the barrels used, you're not getting the flavor line everyone else has. Scotch comes from the initial blend, the barrel, etc. So I don't know if the question is, are they blending and then putting it in a barrel, or if they're blending it after the barrel, maybe. Hey, Julie, if you're still on with us, can you clarify that?
Try to clarify. So while she's clarifying, this is what I'll tell you. So I feel as if during this entire conversation where we're talking about pure malt, and we're talking about blends, and we're talking about the history of Japanese whiskey, where the idea is to create, kick-ass tasting stuff based on the materials at hand, right? But meanwhile, everybody wants to know, yeah, but what type of cask is it? What was the temperature of the water coming off of the still? Oh, all of this stuff.
What was the blood pressure of the distiller the day that he made it? What was his birth?
What was the shoe size? And what did his dog eat? And so
continue with your thought.
And so there's a shop in Chicago. God, I miss Chicago so much through all this COVID. But there's a shop in Chicago called Warehouse Liquors, and Gene Sharness is the owner. And I, much like everybody else watching this, I want to know all of the details. I want to know just everything. And he would always pause and he would tell me, "Don't let facts get in the way of flavor."
That's a pretty good
line. That's pretty great.
That's probably why he's the owner of a liquor shop. That type of mind. Figured it out.
But yeah, it's at the end of the day, are you enjoying what you just poured in your glass? Does the experience of what you're enjoying now match the value, the price that you paid of the bottle? And if so, why do the details matter so much? And I think that there's a bit of truth
there's
to that.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it's everyone's right to be able to ask. Like people want to know, and that's cool. You want to know, but it's not necessarily it's their right to ask, but it's not necessarily their right to know, if that makes sense. So it's like,
yeah,
it's great that people are so inquisitive. It's awesome, but I think Gene's dead on point. Like, is what's in the glass good? Like it's I can't.
Yeah.
That's just again, I'm speaking from personal point of view, but whiskey's been my personal life night and day for 13 years now. And before that, I never even gave it a second thought, even though I was in the booze industry for another 10 years before that. And at the end of my 13 years of really staying eyebrows deep in it, I've come to find that that I, you know, if what's in the glass is good, that's really kind of what I care about at the end. And I've come to find that little shits like Elijah Ammon have a completely different profile, completely different take on it, and that I've got to respect that as well, because everything changes, right? So they like flavor. It's like a moving object. If you think you're going to master it, you're never going to find time to enjoy it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is like, if you're always trying to dissect it, it's going to pass by you without you really just sitting down and enjoying it. Because all of our best moments in whiskey were, while it might have been talking about the whiskey, it had nothing to do with what was in the glass. It had everything to do with the person we were talking about it to. And so you could have been talking about cartoons. You could have been talking about selling out X amount of bottles in 9 minutes and saying, yeah, that was a thing. Or you could have been talking about, you know, so many different things. And that's really the crux of it, isn't it? Or getting drunk as in a hotel room in the base of New York with Sam Philmas drinking a wild turkey bottle till 4 a.m.
That was a great night. So what you're basically saying, you know, in the voice of John Lennon, whiskey is what happens when you're busy dissecting it. Is that what you're saying, basically?
That sounds good to me. I never read any John Lennon, but yeah.
So Julie, and we're gonna end with Julie's. We're gonna end with Julie's question here, and I think I know the answer to it. Basically, and I'm going to distill this question. It seems as if the casks are influencing the flavors for Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, bourbon whiskey, etc.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So yeah, the cask influences the flavor of every whiskey, but the master blender has the final touch or the final kiss on it to give it his signature, right? Yeah. I see. Like, sorry, Julie, it took me a minute to get there. Of course, it's because I am drinking a copious amount of Kilhoman, and yeah. So dead on, right? Like you can see it in everybody's Scotch whiskey, bourbon whiskey, whatever you want. You see it in everyone's signature on a whiskey, and Japanese would be the most prevalent, I would think. Like the guy who blends for Suntory, he eats udon every day, like a bland udon every day for his lunch to try to keep a consistency. So he's always like, so his style is never tweaked, right? And then you have guys like me who just go like with the Fukano stuff. I just go balls out and like just try to really just throw, like, try to figure out how diverse I can make each one, just so that so that I can have fun with it. So everyone's got a style on it, and I think that's dead on accurate.
If you hear my cats fighting, I do apologize. It's hopefully hopefully you can't hear that. So if you don't mind, we're a good 8 minutes over time, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank you for being a part of this. This has been.
Everyone, I'm going to read the comments now, and I'm gonna direct mail each one of you that was talking smack.
Yeah, there you go. No, it's seriously, it's been brilliant, and I thank you for coming back and educating the viewers, re-educating me. And it's a perfect excuse to just sit down and drink a couple good glasses of whiskey with you. So it was a good time. I thank you.
Thanks, man. Thank you for doing all of these. I'm sure the next person is going to knock it out of the park way better than I ever could. Cheers.
So speaking of that, and I'll keep you on before we leave. The next session is the last session, and we are going to be bringing in. Oh, not him. Of course. You're welcome, Brian. Thank you. We will be bringing in none other than the Whiskey Wizard, Jason Johnston Yellen. This will be our final event. And I'm somehow going to be, and that's a week from today, by the way. So the 16th. And I'll be interviewing him about our own company. So that's going to be an interesting experience.
I'll make sure to contribute to the chat for that as well. I've got a bunch of questions.
I'll be watching. I will be watching. All right. Chris, everybody is watching. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your week. And we will see you for the final, the ultimate ImpEx Beverages 3D or Distillery Deep Dive event, December 16 at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Time. And because we have people who apparently live in Central Time, that's at 7:30. And apparently people live in Mountain Time. I never heard of such a thing. That's at 6:30 p.m. But all on December 16th. So cheers, everybody.